I'm John Batchelor. Gordon Chang's with me. It's 66 years since two events like no other in human history. 6th and 9th of August, 1945, the two atomic weapons, one plutonium bomb, one uranium bomb, used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki for the Allies to force the junta, the military dictators who led the Japanese Imperial Army in its massacre of the Pacific peoples, forced the junta to surrender, although they still held out after the second bomb, as incredible as it is to report. And one more firebombing of Tokyo is what pushed them into a coup, and they finally did the obvious and surrendered to the superior forces around them. But for that event, we would be a very different country today, 66 years later. Dr. Henry Miller of the Hoover Institution joins us. Henry, writing in Forbes.com, is commenting on the nuking of Japan and the anniversary and what America might look like today had the Allies been forced to go through with the invasion. Henry, a very good evening to you.
Good evening, John.
As I understand it, your father was slated for the invasion, and I know my father was slated for the invasion. And what were their odds of surviving, Henry?
Well, the odds were really quite grim. As you know, there were a variety of estimates of the casualties and deaths likely in an invasion of the home islands of Japan. An interesting and I think authoritative one, estimate that is, was done by the physicist William Shockley for the staff of the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson. And Shockley estimated that the invasion of the home islands would cost about 1.7 to 4 million American casualties, including between 400,000 and 800,000 fatalities. And that's not to mention the 5 to 10 million deaths that would be expected in Japan as they fought to the last man, which was their intention, apparently.
Henry, obviously the Japanese military establishment was intransigent and wanted to hold out because it took actually 2 bombs to get a surrender. I've heard Japan scholars say that it would actually take more than 2 bombs, that what it took was the Soviet declaration of war against Japan. And that was the event that really tipped the military leaders to sort of throw in the towel. How do you see all of this and, you know, the Soviets and the bomb?
Oh, I think that played a major part, Gordon. You're absolutely right. The Japanese, remember, did not know how many more bombs we had and could see the devastation of city after city of their home islands possible. But clearly they were going to lose China and Manchuria and the remainder of their external empire as well. So all of those conspired.
The question here, though, Henry, and we know 66 years later it's been tossed around, is dropping atomic bombs on human beings, men, women, and children, but especially women and children, was understood then and is understood now as a horrible act. And we've talked about our dads. They were soldiers. There were a lot of soldiers who would have been lost. Casualties doesn't mean dead, but it certainly means damaged. And it's very difficult to convince an audience today that of what could have happened. Your understanding of this 66 years later, as a son who survived, and I'm one too, Henry, how do you think about it personally? Henry Miller, think about your dad not being there or being there, depending on those bombs.
Well, as I said in the article, John, you can look to what happened to the European population in World War I. They had about 13 million dead and lost virtually an entire generation of young men. Britain, France, Germany in particular. So we have the historical example of what that sort of devastation can do, not only to individuals and to the families, but to a population, to a nation as well. Also, I want to make the point, you alluded to the slaughter of civilians.
Yes.
And my colleague and our mutual friend, Dr. Corey Shockey, made the point that I alluded to in the article, that we had really crossed the ethical Rubicon prior to the dropping of the atomic bombs, and that was that civilian populations were fair game in all-out war. And the Germans began it with their atrocities in England and Coventry and London and so on. And, of course, our firebombing of Tokyo before Hiroshima and Nagasaki killed far, far more than were killed in either of the atomic bombs. So that was really the ethical threshold that was much more critical in many ways, if you look at it objectively, than the use of the nuclear weapon.
Right. No, Curtis LeMay, who commanded our B-29, said he was going to burn Japan, and he did. And I mentioned the final firebombing of Japan is what pushed the junta into a coup. Gordon, and I want to make another point here, Gordon, Henry, with Gordon, because to this day, 66 years later, China has not in any way come to terms with Japan because of the depredations, massacre, sadism, and genocide Japan practiced in China. And that Japanese leadership that did that to China was willing to do it to its own people.
Well, certainly. And you know, the interesting thing is that Mao Zedong, who founded the Communist Party, not founded the Communist Party, but brought the Communist Party to power in China, forgave the Japanese. And essentially what's happened since then is that Jiang Zemin, one of his successors, has now brought this whole issue of Japan up. So really things are getting worse. And now you have generations on both sides, in Japan and in China, who weren't there in 1945, who now feel more strongly about it than others.
And Henry, your piece in Forbes reminds me again that I've never resolved this. When I look at it from the point of view of the children I know who were playing or running into the shelters in Hiroshima, and some of them were frozen in place when the blast took off. Others survived, and I've talked to survivors. And then when I come to the fact of what was done in China, what would have been done to our invasion forces, I get stuck, Henry. I just get stuck in between. Do you feel that sometimes, Henry?
I do. There are innumerable ways to look at this, and there are innumerable connections that many of us have to these events. Two of my physics professors at MIT had worked on the Manhattan Project.
We have 20 seconds, Henry. Go ahead.
And one of them tells a story about having driven General Groves to the test site at Alamogordo, and he was unimpressed with the size of the crater and the desert having been turned to glass. And so all of this is very evocative, and there are a lot of stories that this has to offer us in history. It's a fascinating subject.
We are the children of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's who we are. And everyone listening today, same. Henry Miller of the Hoover Institution, Gordon Chang, Forbes.com. Thank you, Gordon. I'm John Batchelor.